But let's unpack the briefing now with political analyst Lukhona Vangqa. Lukhona, good morning and thank you very much for your time. A lot of issues there being deliberated upon, like I said, most notably being crime and the proliferation of guns in our communities. It seems Cabinet has just then gone on to reiterate government's decision to strengthen the police force and establish those specialized task teams. Your views on that?
Yes, good morning, Pund, and good morning to the viewers. You saw the Minister in the Presidency, Mr. Kungubueles, mentioned that Cabinet has decided to strengthen the use of technology as well, above the other interventions, to use big data to be able to identify crime hotspots, which is a bit disappointing, the fact that they are only establishing it now. They're making a decision to establish the use of technology now, because this was mentioned as the DA MP yesterday mentioned that he had made these suggestions about the use of technology in the tackling of crime in the country, and the fact that they still have not moved with the urgency that's needed to be able to put those technological interventions is a bit disappointing. The fact that only now they're looking at the issue of gun violence in the country. They're looking at the proliferation of guns. They're looking at the fact that people are getting gunned down on the streets. That there's now beginning to be a proliferation of mass murders in the country. So the issue of gun violence is something that is going to be topical, and I hope that they're going to move with the requisite urgency to be able to attend to that issue, to firstly minimize the amount of guns that are in circulation, but also deal with police corruption that leads to these guns being spirited out of police safety locks and into the hands of criminals. Because if you remember, Colonel Charles Kania was one of the people that was investigating these issues, that guns were leaving the vaults in Johannesburg and making their way into the Cape Flats, into the hands of criminals and gang leaders.
That has most certainly been a big problem. And when we spoke last week to crime activist Ian Cameron, just debating the president's Sona, he actually went on to say that none of these interventions will work until the police force rids itself of some of the bosses they believe are collaborating with criminals, something that we also heard Julius Malema speaking on in his debate speech. So clearly there's a lot that needs to be done. Your views on just that perhaps these interventions might not work if they don't rid themselves of the corrupt bosses within the police force?
At the heart of that rot, Fundo, is the criminal intelligence that is found in SAPS. If you look at the last leaders of that criminal intelligence, I think the previous 5 have been removed due to corruption and having links or relations with gang leaders. You look at the judgment that came from the Cape High Court, in which the judge put in his judgment that there has been a corruption of the top leadership and the top brass of police by gang leaders. These police leaders are in the pockets well-known gang leaders. So if the issue of crime intelligence is not resolved, then we would not be able to have the intelligence, the information, the capabilities to be able to firstly detect crime, and then after put in interventions to be able to limit or fight criminality. And if the Minister of Police doesn't work to resolve the challenges at criminal intelligence, then we are going to continue to have these problems. We're never going to resolve these challenges.
But how easy would it be for the Minister of Police? Because it would be a controversial step, because in most instances you find a Minister of Police who also wants to have good relations with the policemen on the ground. So when one decides to actually take this controversial step and say, I'm going to have the courage of my convictions and say, listen, South Africans have been saying there's great criminality among bosses within the force and I have to take unpopular decisions. How easy would it be for a minister that must rely on these men in blue, and then he goes on to start scrutinizing their conduct?
There's no other choice that he has, Mfundo. He needs to have the courage of those convictions, as you are saying. This needs to be a person that, because remember, he's dealing with criminal intelligence and spooks and people that work in the dark corners of society that are able to get into the cranny of each and every one of us. So if the minister has skeletons in his own closet, he must be prepared for those skeletons to be aired out when he starts to fight those that have captured criminal intelligence in SAPS. So he must be able to do that. But when he is done with that, he would have it would have been a cathartic exercise for the police and for the country, because he would have cleansed the criminal intelligence of all these rogue elements that are keeping us where we are in terms of the crime levels, in terms of those relationships with gang leaders, and in terms of the proliferation of guns in our society, and illegal guns and guns that belong to the police. So the Minister of Police must be prepared that once he gets into this fight, it's going to get rough, it's going to get dirty, and they're going to play dirty, because he's going to be dealing with spooks. But he needs to have that political will to get into that fight, and he needs to have a stomach for it.
And then on the ejection of the EFF from Parliament, it's been very topical. Journalists asking Mr. Ngungubele on this, but he basically said there's no discomfort around the manner in which the police reacted. It was a fluid situation and no one could read what would happen next. What are your views on this, particularly given that some opposition parties raise concern around the presence of the armed police in the chambers?
I don't think the erring on the side of caution should be the approach that is taken by a democratic executive of government, Mfundo, because once you start to violate the separation of powers, the separation of powers in the state, you need to do so in the most critical. If you have to do so, you need to do so in the most critical of environments. But if you're going to violate and have armed police on the floor of Parliament over a person that is carrying a placard, then I don't think it has risen to that level yet. So the president says he didn't feel under threat. He himself, Minister Ngungubele, doesn't seem to think that the president was under threat. He just says that it was a surprise. Well, obviously it would be a surprise because it's a protest. That's the nature of protests. They are meant to be disruptive. But if those protests, if there's a charging to the stage wherein you can foresee an intent of physical violence or harm to the president, then you can have that intervention. But if someone is carrying a placard, obviously there is no a threat there. And we must ask the question, is protest allowed in our parliament? And if protest is allowed in our parliament, should that protest be disruptive? Well, by the very definition of protest, they are meant to be disruptive. So if you're going to use police and armed services to stop protest in parliament, then you're going to have an infringement on very many founding principles of our constitution, including the freedom of speech, including the separation of the arms of the powers of the state. So I don't think it was a good thing to have seen that armed police would be on the floor of our parliament, and I hope courts will be approached to pronounce on this thing.
But if I look at Siviwe Rahube's criticism, it was balanced, criticized the force and the speaker for her handling of the whole situation, but also criticized the EFF as well to a certain extent, saying there was never a more important time to hear the first citizen of the country than that opportunity we had with Sona. And she felt that that level of disruption should not be allowed to continue in Parliament, particularly in this era where we really need to hear from the president and then go on to critique some of his interventions.
It's undesirable. I think that's what she would wanted to have said. It's undesirable to have these disruptions in Parliament, but is it permissible? Are they allowed to have these protests for the EFF to stage such protests in Parliament? I think if you look at it from that instance, the Constitution does give them the right to protest when they feel that they need to protest. But is it desirable to have the head of state, to have our government and our parliament unable to function because of these disruptions? It is certainly not desirable, and I would agree with her on that. I think there are other means that the EFF as well needs to start to pursue to be able to hold Parliament, to be able to hold the President and his cabinet accountable. I don't remember the last time the EFF put in a motion of no confidence against the President or a motion of no confidence against his cabinet. And those are some of the mechanisms that the EFF needs to explore in greater ways. But are they allowed to protest in Parliament? My personal opinion is that they are allowed to do so. But is it desirable? My opinion is it's not.
And then broadly speaking, your views on the Sona debate, a number of opposition parties quite critical of the president's address. Your take on everything that we saw these past 2 days?
So the Sona debate, I crystallized it into three thematic areas that came to take center stage yesterday and the day before. It's the 5-year term of the president. I think you saw people start to reflect on that 5-year term and what it has meant to the country. You've heard people express an opinion, MPs, that he's now beginning to be worse than his predecessor, Jacob Zuma, and I think that's quite an insult to the president for him to be seen as worse than 9 wasted years. The EFF said he's driving the country in reverse gear and is going backwards. John Steenhuisen said that he's got his own, or he started well on his way in his own 9 wasted years. So you had the UDM as well also speak to that. So that's the first thematic area. The second one was the state of disaster. And you had the feeling that the state of disaster from the ANC and their speakers is only localized to electricity. This is the only state of disaster that we're dealing with. But the other political parties started to extend this definition of a state disaster to say it attaches itself also to our rail networks, also to the state of our roads, also to the state of crime, GBV and femicide into the country. That's also in a state of disaster. Also, the cabinet of the president is in a state of disaster because ministers are failing. They highlighted Minister Pravin Gordhan, Gwatemantashe failing on electricity, the vacancies that are in cabinet, the fact that the deputy president has resigned and is just, a seat warmer there and is not undertaking any substantive business of government. So that's the second thematic area. The final thematic area that you saw was on the issue of crime on its own being highlighted by the MPs. So the fact that the recent gunning down in cold blood of AKA and the mass murders that you saw happening in PE and in other parts of the Eastern Cape brought into sharp focus the issue of crime and the high rates of crime and criminality in this country, and brought in question the leadership of Bheki Cele on SAPS. And I think a lot of political parties asked for his head, Bheki Cele, so he had to go and defend himself. And I don't remember the ANC coming out in his defense in terms of the high crime rates. So that's how I've characterized the debate so far, Fundo.
But then now looking at Ronald Lamola as the sweeper of the ANC, he went on to reduce everything that we heard of the other political parties to mere electioneering. He basically said that he didn't hear politicians debating the substance of that address by the president. What he heard were a number of politicians taking to the podium to actually read out their manifestos.
I think it's quite correct. So if you listen to some of the persona dramatisai that were coming from the opposition parties, one of the things that they spoke about was the need to vote in 2024 and vote for their political parties, to be exact. The EFF did that, the DA did that, and I think other political parties such as the ATM also did that. So he's quite correct. That podium for the Sona debate was used as a podium for electioneering by opposition political parties, and I don't think I heard the ANC use that podium to call for voters to vote for the ANC. So I think I would agree with that analysis from the sweep of the ANC.
But would you say it's in its entirety, or they did debate and give us solutions? I mean, just listening to Floyd Shivambu, he proposed a number of solutions to deal with electricity and basically using China as his model for some of those solutions. So would you say it's in its entirety they were there to push for people to vote for their political parties, or they did to a certain extent debate the address itself and come up with solutions to address particularly the electricity crisis?
Oh, no, they debated, like I said, identifying the thematic areas. They debated the Sona. I was just saying that they did use that opportunity to start, their campaign season for 2024 in earnest. But no, they did. There was a vigorous debate. And unfortunately, some of the times you find that some of the cookie cutter debates, for an example, are not appreciated by even those that make the arguments. For an example, Ronald Lamola saying that the EFF is just dusting off
ANC policies, yes,
of the ANC policies. That's not true. ANC has abandoned some of those policies a long time ago. I mean, he argued that the ANC has made, or ESCOM is now investing in renewables, and therefore that they are taking the EFF an idea that ESCOM must be intimately involved in investment into renewables, into renewable energy sources. ESCOM is not doing that. ESCOM is breaking up into three pieces, like Floyd Shivambu said.
But there's the Komati
ESCOM
power
is leaving
station
the
that they're
area.
repurposing. But there's Komati power station in Mpumalanga that they're repurposing. So would that not be one where you're seeing them playing in that space themselves?
No, but they're not intimately involved. That's one isolated incident. ESCOM, if you remember, released parcels of land that are closest to their grid for independent power producers to come in and set up green energy fields into that. That's an area of investment that they could have been taking up for themselves, but they didn't do so because there is a sort of a retraction by ESCOM in the area of renewable energies and allowing independent power producers to get into that space. ESCOM needs to have a serious policy of investment into that particular space so that we can see them becoming intimately involved. Repurposing one or two power stations is not going to cut it in terms of intimate involvement.
Lukhona, thank you very much for your time this morning. That's political analyst Lukhona Vangqa. We await the president's response to that debate later today. More news on the other side of this break. Do stay with us.